Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Civil Wars, the United States, Latin America, Europe, and the Crisis of the 1860s. Edited by Don H. Doyle. Narrated by Johnny Heller and Joanna Perrin. Introduction. The Atlantic World and the Crisis of the 1860s. Don H. Doyle. For more than a century and a half, historians have told the story of America's Civil War within a familiar nation-bound narrative. Most accounts center on the growing tensions between North and South over slavery, the clash of arms, the generals and political leaders on each side, the civilians at the home front, and the ordeal of Reconstruction. It is a quintessential American story about the nation's defining crisis. This book takes listeners away from the battlefields and political debates in the United States to view the conflict as part of a larger global crisis that seized the Atlantic world in the 1860s. Our book joins the international turn among historians, endeavoring to understand the modern past as something more than the sum of national histories. In addition to expanding the frame that normally surrounds the U.S. Civil War, our goal has been to situate the war and Reconstruction within a transnational complex of upheavals that included multiple civil wars, European invasions, separatist rebellions, independence and unification struggles, slave uprising, and slave emancipations. The various points of turbulence we examine were all connected to a vast web whose radial cords attached to Washington and Richmond, but also fastened at Mexico City, Havana, Santo Domingo, Rio de Janeiro, and other nodes of power in the American hemisphere. Other radials span the Atlantic to connect at London, Paris, Madrid, Rome, and myriad points between and beyond these major centers of state power. Tremors at any point in this web reverberated to distant connections in the network, constantly creating new dangers and opportunities for different actors in this dramatic decade. Our notion of a multifaceted, interconnected set of crises derives from an understanding that all these violent upheavals were not just coincidental with, but also connected to, the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. imbroglio was not always the first cause in this dynamic scheme. Mexico's Reform War preceded it, but it often enabled ensuing events. The European incursions in Latin America that took place in the early 1860s, for example, would have been far riskier had the United States not been ensnared in a protracted civil war. Likewise, had slavery been preserved within an independent confederacy, the future of slavery would have been fortified in the Spanish Caribbean and Brazil. The cross-currents of causation and influence did not always flow outward from the United States. They ran in various directions across the web of entangled histories. Thus, France's ambitions in Mexico, Spain's commitment to hold on to Cuba, and Britain's anxiety over defending Canada opened to the insurgent Confederacy the possibility of allying with European powers. The threat of such alliances, in turn, imposed limitations on what the United States could do in the face of the bold European incursions in the Western Hemisphere carried out in flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. Civil War erupted out of its own domestic political and social tensions. From the beginning, however, this conflict became enmeshed in multifarious international conflicts, imperial rivalries, and distant civil wars, such that we cannot understand any one part of this crisis in isolation from the larger web of conflict and imperial ambition that pervaded the Atlantic world in the 1860s. Apart from the coincidence and connections among the several intra-state and international clashes that constituted the crisis of the 1860s, there were also common political and social questions enveloping all these conflicts. Foremost among these was the future of slavery, a question of momentous importance, not only to the U.S. conflict, but also to the entire region extending from the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico to Brazil. Many think of slavery in the 1860s as a barbaric relic of the past, doomed to eventual extinction within a modern capitalist world that required a free, mobile system of labor. However, the future of slavery was far from certain when the U.S. secession crisis erupted. Driving the U.S. South's bid for independence was its determination to protect slavery from a federal government that had fallen into the hands of the anti-slavery Republican Party. Southern secessionists had more in mind than simply protecting slavery where it existed. They saw independence as an essential prerequisite to fulfilling their dream of a tropical empire that would encompass the Caribbean and the territory surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. During its war against the United States, expediency required that Confederate diplomats deny any such imperial ambitions, lest they alienate potential allies, particularly Spain and France. Whether or not an independent confederacy would have allied with or conquered new territories in Latin America, the world would have faced a powerful bastion of slave-based plantation economies spanning North America, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Never mind the possibilities for expanding slavery into Central America and Mexico. As it happened, the defeat of the slaveholders' rebellion in the United States set the stage for the demise of slavery in Spain's Caribbean colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in Brazil. The long history of slavery in the Americas faced the beginning of the end, as Spain and then Brazil placed slavery on a slow road to eventual extinction with the passage of free womb laws, which granted freedom to the children of slave mothers. Subsequent laws passed by Spain in 1886 and Brazil in 1888 abolished slavery once and for all. At stake also in the crisis of the 1860s was the future of the Republican experiment, which had endured in the American hemisphere but had been all but extinguished in Europe. Just as some are inclined to see slavery as an atavistic holdover from the pre-capitalist past, there is a common tendency to see democratic forms of government as the inevitable wave of the future for the modern world. Looking back from 1861, the age of revolution that began in Europe with the French Revolution was largely a litany of failed revolutionary struggles and a testimony to the remarkable resilience of the old regime of church and crown. At the end of the Revolution of 1848, though some European monarchies had conceded civil liberties to their subjects and accepted constitutional limits on their powers, there were no self-governing republics of any size in Europe outside of Switzerland. Europe remained a bastion of monarchies and empires in opposition to republicanism, and even more to democratic ideas of universal suffrage. The Latin American Wars of Independence, 1810 to 1825, brought onto the world stage a host of new republics, which reinforced the perception of modern republicanism as an American phenomenon. Mexico experimented briefly with the monarchy under Emperor Agustín de Iturbide, 1821 to 1823, before embarking on the republican experiment. All the other former colonies of Spain eventually followed the same republican path. Only Brazil, having served as the seat of the Portuguese Empire during the Napoleonic invasion of Iberia, maintained a permanent monarchy after independence. The young Spanish-American republics, rife with pronunciamientos, civil wars, caudillos, and revolutionary upheavals, were proof to conservative critics that the Latin temperament was ill-suited to anything but the authoritarian rule of monarchs and priests. That the Empire of Brazil remained a notable exception to the tumult afflicting Latin America was not lost on critics of the Republican experiment. For all their troubles with self-government, Latin Americans displayed a tenacious devotion to Republican ideals. Unlike Europe, which had largely repudiated the Republican experiment in favor of monarchy, the Latin American republics did not revert to monarchy, except as listeners of this volume will learn in Santo Domingo and Mexico, where European powers interceded. During the 1860s, the entire American hemisphere as a whole became a contested site for the experiment in popular sovereignty. European cynics believed that popular government, in whatever form, was inherently fragile, tenuous, and sooner or later destined to descend into anarchy and revolution, or into some form of despotism, especially under the strain of war, which they thought republics were ill-equipped to conduct. Most conservatives, even many liberals in Europe and the Americas, therefore, regarded extreme democracy with universal manhood suffrage and raucous party rivalries more as a threat than a safeguard to individual liberty. Constitutional monarchy and the British model, with a strong parliament and freedom of speech and assembly, was thought to be the best guarantor of liberty and progress. The vaunted Great Republic, as admirers frequently called the United States, had long been an exemplary model of popular sovereignty success. By 1861, however, the secession crisis seemed to prove the rule that all such experiments were doomed to eventual self-destruction. Some monarchists, witnessing the failure of the U.S. example, predicted that all the republics of the Americas would gravitate back toward monarchy or seek European imperial protection. If the idea that the United States or any of the Latin American republics might abandon democracy and subject themselves to monarchy and imperial rule seems wildly implausible today, that is due to our present-minded conceit that progress in the modern world has inexorably followed a democratic trajectory. However, in the 1860s, the Republican experiment seemed a proven failure in Europe and was about to enter a strenuous trial in its American nursery. During the 1860s, the future was uncertain, and all things were possible. France's Napoleon III was eager to assist the return to monarchy by transforming Mexico into a model of imperial order and Catholic moral authority. During the 40 years since winning independence from Spain, Mexico witnessed no less than 50 changes in government. Liberals introduced radical reforms in the 1850s that curtailed the power and wealth of the church and extended civil rights to all citizens. When liberals won control of the government in 1857, the conservatives, backed by wealthy landowners and the Catholic clergy, plunged the country into a prolonged civil war known as the Reform War, which ended in early 1861 with the Liberals still in control of the government. Having failed to defeat Liberal opponents at the ballot box and then on the battlefield, Mexico's conservatives turned to European monarchs to rescue them from the specter of Republican rule. For decades, Napoleon III had been considering Mexico and its strategic role in his global scheme to restore France to the imperial glory it had known under his uncle, Napoleon I, now on a global scale. The control and stabilization of Mexico were essential to his plan for an inter-ocean canal across Central America, the key to imperial mastery of the Pacific and Atlantic. Mexico's salvation, according to Napoleon III's grand design, would also be the first step in the regeneration of the Latin race throughout the Americas. The Empire of Mexico, in time, would serve as a model and protector for all the troubled Spanish-American republics and might even form an alliance with South America's monarchical anchor, the Empire of Brazil. With help from the insurgent Confederacy, Napoleon III's Latin American empire would impede the insidious influence of Anglo-Saxon republicanism emanating from the United States. The intrusions by European powers in Latin America point to a third common thread. In addition to slavery and republicanism, running through many facets of the crisis of the 1860s, the issue of national sovereignty and territorial unity. Each nation-state involved in this story was seeking to secede, unite, expand, ally with foreign powers, or impose itself on other nations by conquest or diplomatic intervention. The national idea, which supposed that nations ought to contain coherent populations and that governments should represent the popular will, was still taking form in the mid-19th century. The idea that a people had the natural right to govern themselves, a hallmark of liberal nationalist ideology, was seized by the insurgent slaveholders in the U.S. South. Unionists were left to assert the right of the existing nation to defend itself against rebellious minorities, an imperial stance that confounded European liberals. It was only the beginning of enormous legal and moral confusion surrounding such basic questions as the justification for international recognition, the legitimacy of insurgent states, the right of foreign powers to intervene in domestic disputes, and a host of other vexing questions that surfaced with compelling urgency in the 1860s. The historic contest between principles of dynastic sovereignty and inherited privilege against those of popular sovereignty and human equality were suddenly playing out in real-life choices that politicians, diplomats, and ordinary citizens had to confront. If the Confederacy's claim to national sovereignty should be determined by nothing other than the capacity of an insurgent rebellion to defend itself militarily, were there not moral or legal grounds on which the family of nations might legitimately deny recognition? By the same token, should the people of Mexico or Santo Domingo decide they no longer wanted to govern themselves and invite a European prince to rule over them, was national subjugation also justifiable and legitimate? It was telling that even the most blatant usurpations of power were veiled in plebiscites, often specious but supposed to determine the popular will. Southern secessionists took great pains to deny their revolutionary intent, and several states took the time to hold popular elections to nominate delegates or, more rarely, to vote on secession itself. Maximilian insisted that the French carry out a plebiscite before he assumed the throne of Mexico. A similar bow to the fiction of popular consent took place in Santo Domingo to legitimize its return to the Spanish Empire. The secessionist rebellion in the United States suddenly threw open new opportunities for France, Spain, and Britain to create, expand, or secure their imperial domain in the American hemisphere. Britain, worried that the United States would find some pretext to take over Canada, began recalculating its North American imperial policy. In 1863, it began fashioning a new self-governing polity that was inaugurated 4 years later as the Dominion of Canada. In contrast, following a violent clash with discontented blacks at Morant Bay, Jamaica, the British imposed more direct control of Jamaica's colonial affairs. Having proclaimed the annexation of Santo Domingo in 1861, Spain went on to provoke war with Peru and Chile, which many saw as part of a larger plan to take back its lost American empire. France took the prize for imperial ambition in the Americas. At its boldest expression, France's vision included proxy control of a vast Mexican empire that would expand southward to incorporate the proposed canal through Nicaragua and northward to reclaim the territory ceded to the United States in 1848, including Mexico's former province, Texas. Since Louisiana had severed its ties to the United States, the idea was floated that France might also assert its right to recover the vast territory Napoleon I had sold to the United States in 1803. Far more than just territory and geopolitical advantage were at stake in the global contest among rival European empires. The future of slavery and survival of democracy also hung in the balance during the crisis of the 1860s. Had the European powers actually intervened in the U.S. Civil War, or had the Union otherwise failed to defeat the rebellion, it would have meant a new lease on life for slavery, and not only in the American South. A Confederate victory would have rekindled the long-held Southern dream of a tropical slave empire in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, either in alliance with the slave regimes of the Spanish Caribbean and Brazil, or possibly the conquest of the former. We must also consider that, had the South won independence, Maximilian's Mexican Empire, instead of being a nearly forgotten, ill-starred adventure, would have played out very differently, with an independent confederacy acting as a buffer state, protecting Mexico from U.S. interference. As it was, General Ulysses S. Grant sent Union troops to the Texas border in the summer of 1865 to intimidate French forces and fortify Benito Juárez's Republican Army with clandestine supplies of arms and ammunition. Had the French experiment succeeded in Mexico, it is also likely that the American hemisphere would have presented irresistible temptations for further European imperialist adventures. Instead, soon after the Union victory in 1865, there was a major withdrawal of European empires from the Western Hemisphere. To some extent, this was part of a redeployment of imperial resources. The U.S. Civil War helped accelerate European expansion into warm, cotton-producing regions of the world because it disrupted exports from the world's largest supplier of cotton. The 1860s witnessed the dawn of a new age of imperialism in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, coinciding with the withdrawal of Europe from the Western Hemisphere. Compelling the European retreat was the emergence of the United States as a powerful military force, capable of mobilizing a massive citizen army, building a powerful navy, replete with ironclad ships, and sustaining unprecedented losses over several years. The Monroe Doctrine, which European powers scoffed at during the war, now became a viable deterrent to European plans for further colonization in the Americas. Britain's creation of a self-governing confederation in Canada coincided with the decision of Russia to cede to the United States all of its territorial claims to Alaska and the Pacific Northwest in 1867. Spain, too, facing fierce guerrilla resistance from Republicans in Santo Domingo and mounting opposition from the liberal opposition in Madrid, withdrew its troops in the summer of 1865. During the U.S. war, Spain had also taken aggressive action against Peru and Chile for supposed offenses to the Spanish flag, which led Peruvian and Chilean Republicans to prepare for war and seek help abroad, including from the United States. Fearing another disastrous war in Latin America and revolutionary opposition at home, Spain's imperialists eventually swallowed their pride. With the United States serving as mediator, Spain settled its differences with Peru and Chile and withdrew from South America. In the fall of 1868, Spain suddenly faced dual revolutions, at home and in Cuba. Cuban Republicans proclaimed independence and invited slaves to join them, with vague promises of freedom for those who fought for Cuba's freedom. All during the U.S. war, American diplomats reported on Cuban slaves chanting, "Avanza Lincoln, avanza, tu eres nuestra esperanza." Onward, Lincoln, onward, you are our hope, as though they knew their fate somehow hinged on the outcome of the war to their north. Now a rebellion for independence within Cuba seemed to realize that hope. Cuba's Republican insurgency dragged on a decade without achieving freedom for Cuba, but it struck severe blows for freedom among Cuba's slaves. In 1870, Spain answered the Cuban Republican promise of freedom to slaves with its own. The Moray Law emancipated all children henceforth born to slave mothers, and it promised freedom to slaves who took up arms for the Spanish crown against the Republican insurrection. Brazil followed suit the next year with its own law for gradual emancipation. These free womb laws would have continued slavery well into the 20th century had it not been for Spain's enactment of full emancipation in 1886, followed by Brazil in 1888. A hugely profitable system of labor that had been integral to the economy, law, and society of American nations for centuries ended at last. Meanwhile, Napoleon III abandoned his grand design to regenerate the Latin race in the American hemisphere. Facing both growing opposition from reinvigorated French liberals and the rise of a united German nation across the Rhine, in early 1866 he announced the French civilizing mission in Mexico was at an end. Mexico's Republican forces, aided by arms and volunteers from the United States, won stunning victories against Maximilian's diminished forces. The United States took an official response of neutrality, refusing to recognize or meet with Maximilian's government. In June 1867, the beleaguered Emperor of Mexico, having been captured, tried, and sentenced to death, faced a Mexican firing squad. The shots fired that day resounded across the Atlantic, a somber reproach to further European ambitions in the Americas. The reverberations from the Americas after 1865 shook the thrones of Europe as well. The Union's victory gave Republicans and other liberal reformers in Europe a thrill of vindication and hope that the Republican experiment might yet be revived in Europe. Political leaders, whatever distrust they felt toward democracy's successes, ignored the restive public mood at their peril. British radicals favoring expansion of voting rights mobilized immense public demonstrations across Britain beginning in 1866. Facing massive civil disobedience during riots in London's Hyde Park, Parliament enacted the Reform Act of 1867, which vastly expanded voting rights among the middle and working classes. Spain, one of the more conservative countries in Western Europe, also faced revolutionary upheaval in 1868. The Glorious Revolution toppled Queen Isabel II from her throne and opened up a brief, troubled period of representative government. In France, the opposition to Napoleon III's Second Empire had been galvanized by the Mexican fiasco and by Napoleon's flirtation with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. But the opposition came to a boil when Napoleon provoked war with Prussia in 1870. After being ignominiously captured by Prussian forces at the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon fled to exile in England. France, the birthplace of modern European republicanism, cautiously proclaimed its Third Republic. The 1860s began with a powerful separatist rebellion to preserve and expand a system of slavery in North America. This coincided with an equally daring effort to defeat liberal reforms by the imposition of European monarchy in Mexico. It ended with the destruction of slavery, the retreat of European imperialism from the Western Hemisphere, and the resurgence of liberal hope in the Americas and Europe. Those hopes can easily be overshadowed by what followed in the 1860s. The failings of Reconstruction in the United States, the return of despotism to Latin America, the rise of European and U.S. imperialism, the ascendance of scientific racism, and all the horrors these forces would visit upon the 20th century. But all that lay ahead. For a moment, it seemed that the age of revolution, thought to have died in Europe in 1849, had shifted to the Americas to rescue the Republican experiment from self-destruction and strike a lethal blow to slavery. To comprehend the multifaceted crisis of the 1860s in all its complexity has required a form of collaboration, all too rare among historians, who typically spend their careers mastering one geographic area within a coherent historical period. No one person could perform all the archival research and learn all the scholarship required for a full understanding of each part of the puzzle assembled here. Our volume demonstrates the value of teamwork among specialists who both pooled their knowledge and engaged one another's work as part of a common endeavor. Our project began with a conference held at the University of South Carolina in March 2014, which involved 3 days of discussion and criticism, leavened with welcome doses of convivial intellectual camaraderie. Each author brought a specialized knowledge of one piece of the puzzle, and each came away with an understanding of how their piece fit into the larger picture of this turbulent and crucial decade. The result is more than a collection of specialized essays. This is a multi-authored book that addresses a sprawling geography within a coherent period. All the essays support a common endeavor and examine facets of a common project. The volume begins with 4 essays on aspects of the U.S. Civil War, with particular attention to Union and Confederate foreign policy strategies. 3 essays on the major European powers tell us how Britain, France, and Spain responded to the U.S. imbroglio and how it shaped their imperial strategies. Finally, 5 essays examine aspects of Latin America's role in the crisis of the 1860s, with particular attention to Santo Domingo, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, and Spanish America. We aimed our essays at students and teachers looking for a fuller understanding of the events in this tumultuous decade and wanting to understand the entangled histories of all the countries involved. We are aware that our essays cannot do full justice to the subject. J. Sexton's opening essay on the Civil War and U.S. world power focuses on the role of the Civil War in the realization of U.S. national and global power in the 19th century. Though the Civil War gave evidence of the immense military and economic power of the United States, he shows, the projection of that power on the world stage also required foreign collaboration. Howard Jones's Wrapping the World in Fire, the interventionist crisis in the Civil War, takes up Union foreign policy and the diplomatic contest between the Union and the Confederacy that unfolded in Britain and France. While the Union insisted that the conflict was a domestic quarrel and warned outside nations against interference, the Confederacy set out to court foreign recognition, if not intervention, which many understood to be the key to winning independence. Both Britain and France weighed the advantages of intervention against the threat of war with the United States, and their calculations played a decisive role in the outcome of the conflict. The next essay deals with the less familiar realm of Confederate imperial ambitions and their effect on foreign relations during the U.S. Civil War. Patrick J. Kelly, The Cat's Paw, Confederate Ambitions in Latin America, examines tensions between the South's aspirations for hemispheric dominance and its need to curry favor with the European imperial powers and Latin American neighbors. In the maelstrom of Civil War, Confederates found it expedient to deny their imperialistic ambitions in Latin America and necessary to condone those of Spain and France, as the South sought foreign allies in their struggle for independence. The next 3 essays deal with the major European empires involved in the crisis of the 1860s, Britain, France, and Spain. Richard Hussey's essay on Manifest Dominion, the British Empire and the Crises of the Americas in the 1860s, reveals Britain anxiously recalculating the risks and opportunities presented by the crisis in the United States. Its interests in the Western Hemisphere, ranging from the Mosquito Coast in Jamaica to Manitoba, were but a part of a rapidly expanding empire with increasingly important assets in India, China, the Middle East, and Africa, to say nothing of its primary concerns with the European balance of power. Steve Sandod takes up France's grand design in the Confederacy, which he explains was the pet project of Napoleon III to create in Mexico a counterbalance against the growing power of Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the United States. The American Civil War opened an ideal opportunity for France to carry out this long-considered project, and Confederate independence appeared to be essential to its success. As Sanlaud's deep research in French diplomatic correspondence reveals, Napoleon III's more sober-minded foreign ministers felt that France had more to fear from an independent South than a unified United States. Again, the South's long-standing enthusiasm for expanding slavery southward.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?